thanks everybody again, and thank you, Deborah, for your introduction, and welcome to our August session of BusinessWise Insiders. This month's topic is something that we've touched on fairly frequently in previous Insider sessions from a few different angles, but it's such an important concept when it comes to B2B prospecting that we wanted to drill down even further. And that's how to sell the first appointment with a new prospect, even if they may never buy from you. One point of clarification before we start: for the purposes of this discussion, we're talking about trying to set appointments with targeted prospects. And exactly what targeted means will depend on your industry, your business model, and your general approach to business development. So for some of you, targeted prospects may only be the ones who are actively looking to solve and have budgeted for a particular problem. And for others, it may be a prospect at a much earlier stage of the buying cycle where they may not even be consciously aware that they have a problem that needs solving. And we'll come back to that idea at the end of the presentation, but keep it in mind as we move through the presentation. So you might be asking yourself, isn't the point of sales to sell your product or service? Well, yes, but it's obviously not quite so simple. First, when we say sales, we don't literally mean just sales. We mean the entire process of new business development, which entails building as many relationships at the opening of your funnel as possible in order to maximize the number of deals you ultimately close. And that means first-time appointments with prospects who may never buy from you. And that's a really critical point. So look at it another way. We all want that big yes from our prospect, the one where they agree to sign on the dotted line and become a client. But there are many more micro yeses that lead up to that point that are also critical. So if the big question at the top of the mountain is, will you buy my product? The small questions along the way are, will you open my email? Will you read and respond? Will you take my call? Will you have a conversation? And for the purposes of today's presentation, will you meet with me? And each of those elicits a small yes that nudges a prospect further up the mountain toward that big question. And of course, the flip side of a yes is a no. And sales reps should all be familiar with the different forms no can take. Typically, when we think of common prospect objections, we think of these four categories. Not interested, where they don't realize they have a problem, they're happy with the way they are. A bad experience, they've tried something similar before and it was terrible. The timing is bad, they have a lot going on, they don't have the budget, the contract isn't up yet, or they ask you to send more info. So not right now, but send me some info and I'll get back to you. But if you think about the topic of today's presentation for a second, selling that first-time appointment, the interesting thing is that none of these common objections is an objection to meeting with you. It's an objection to buying from you. And here's the thing, it's very likely that your prospect isn't even close to thinking about buying when you reach them via cold call or cold email. So of course, they're going to default to a common objection. And this is a major reason why you should focus on selling the appointment rather than selling your product or service. When you try to sell your product to a new prospect, you make your job harder than it has to be. First, you make a small decision and turn it into a big one by forcing your prospect to think about that big, complicated buying decision to justify taking an appointment with you. Second, and along those same lines, you give them a reason to say no by allowing them to say, I'm happy with the way things are, or to fall back on one of the other common objections. And finally, you immediately put yourself on a different level than where your prospect is because you're talking about your product or service and they're not remotely thinking about buying. So before we get into the substance of the presentation, here are just some key points that you should keep in mind as we dig in. Stay in the present, stay in the moment. You're not going to close a complex B2B sale with a cold call or an email. Understand where you are in the process at the beginning. Start small. Those big risky decisions will scare your prospect off. You want to make your prospect's decision simple and safe. And then finally, climb the ladder. You can't climb a ladder in one step, so aim for the next step and not the final step. Deborah, did you want to add anything? All right, so let's get started with a little psychology, because selling your appointment isn't just a good biz dev strategy. It harnesses the power of psychology to increase the odds of a prospect engagement. You may have heard of Dr. Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. Excuse me. Our longtime insiders should be familiar because we touch on this often. Dr. Cialdini is a professor of marketing and psychology, and his book is based on that premise that people use mental shortcuts to help them make decisions faster. So Dr. Cialdini identified 6 principles of persuasion, laying out specific triggers that activate those mental shortcuts. And each of these principles is at work in nearly every aspect of successful business development. But 2 in particular really show the power of selling your prospect on the value of an appointment. And those are these first 2 on the slide: reciprocity and commitment and consistency. So the principle of reciprocity holds that people feel obliged to give back to others what they have received. So in this example, our owl on the top offers to pay for lunch, and the one on the bottom immediately thinks of returning the favor. Even if that owl would never have thought of paying for lunch on its own, the offer triggers an internal obligation. And then the second principle is commitment and consistency, which is the idea that people like to be consistent with the things they've previously said or done. So here the blue owl on the top asks for 2 things. First, it asks the orange owl to sign his petition. It's a small request, so orange says yes, and then blue asks for a donation to the same cause, and here's where the action trigger comes in. Since orange has already expressed its support for the cause by signing the petition, it feels much more compelled to follow through on that support by giving money. So how do these work in the context of setting an appointment? Well, reciprocity is at work whenever you offer something of value for free and no strings attached. So not only is that kind of offer hard to resist for obvious reasons, but because your prospect benefits without having to invest anything but their own time, it increases the likelihood that she'll say yes when you do ask her for something. And commitment and consistency is at work because you're asking for something small now, a short meeting or conversation with no strings attached, which paves the way for you to ask for something bigger later. And on the right, you can see how this kind of combines. When you sell the appointment and say something like, are you open to a 30-minute meeting to learn how new trends will affect your business? You're asking for something small and you're offering something in return. So you can see how it all comes together. Deborah, did you want to say anything before we get into the next slide? Hold on. Muted Deborah, but can you unmute or no? Oh, there we go. Oops. All right, well, I'm going to keep.
Hey.
Oh, there you go. Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you for the unmute. I just wanted to ask everybody to think about the things and talk to your team about the insights and knowledge that you have about that your prospect may not have, and share it using outside data sources, etc. And these are the kinds of things that you want to be thinking about and presenting to your prospect. And they might be, they should be tied in to your overall offer of your products and services, but they are not about specifically about your products and services.
Thanks, Devin. We'll get into the details of specific things that you can offer your prospects a little bit later in the presentation to give you an idea of how that might take shape. So let's start looking at how this actually works in practice. The first step is to make a plan for how exactly you're going to ask for and sell the appointment. And we have a couple of tactics that we use that we wanted to share with you. So the first is one of our go-to cold call scripts, which we use after a prospect has answered the phone and agreed to spend a few minutes talking with us. And it's called The Reason I'm Calling, and the acronym we use is TRIC. So the idea behind Trick is twofold. First, it helps you remember to be direct and get to the point. It's the beginning of a sentence where the end of it has to be a reason that you're calling. And it highlights that your call has a purpose that both you and your prospects are clear on. And as you can see in the 3 examples that I've used here, the reason I'm calling is to ask if you're open to, is to set a time to meet, is to show you some ideas about. Our purpose is always about defining that next goal, a meeting where we're providing value to our prospect, no strings attached. And then the second follow-up is to ask explicitly, do you have your calendar in front of you? What does Wednesday afternoon look like? If that doesn't work, what's better? So explicitly asking for time to discuss these ideas of value that you have to offer. And it works the same way with email, and we're big believers in getting right to the point. We've found that emails get a lot more responses when you tell your prospects what you want in those first 2 or 3 sentences of your email. So sentences like these, I'm writing to ask you, I'd like to connect about, are you open to a 15-minute call to discuss, are great ways to lead directly into your offer. And there are 3 examples here of what your offer might be, or requests, so your prospect immediately understands what you want him to do, so he can decide whether to do it. So beyond asking for the appointment, the whole point here is to sell your prospect on the benefit of a no strings attached appointment. And here are some frameworks we've found to be successful. So really ask yourself, what does your prospect get even if he or she never becomes a client? And 3 frames are: first, knowledge. For example, you'll learn key forces and trends that will shape the industry over the next 12 to 18 months. Another is intelligence. So how other firms in your industry are adapting and staying ahead of the curve. And then finally, perspective. The information you'll gather will help you redefine what success means and clarify your decisions toward that success. Deborah, anything here? And I think I've successfully made you a co-host, so you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, when you think about an executive briefing or sharing executive insights in a 15-minute conversation, compared to a prospect learning about your company's history or your marquee clients, or that executive briefing compared to a sales pitch about how valuable your products and services are, think about if you were that prospect, which you would prefer to commit to.
Exactly. So we've talked a little bit about how psychology works and the importance of explicitly asking for and selling an appointment, but this is all getting at the idea of value that you're delivering to your prospects. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the different forms value takes in the sales and prospecting process. So we understand the idea is to offer your prospects something of value, no strings attached, in order to give them a compelling reason to meet with you. So the question becomes, what is your value proposition? So value proposition is somewhat of a jargony term. So to define it clearly, a value proposition is how you communicate your unique value to your prospects so that they clearly understand why they should do business with you. But there's one phrase on the slide that needs to be edited for the purposes of today's topic, because a lot of the time when we talk about value proposition, we're talking about the buying decision, the decision about why to do business with you. But if we change the words do business or focus in on those words, we realize that your value proposition isn't only about why prospects should buy. Some of you may have heard of Flint McLaughlin and Mech Labs, but if you haven't, they're an organization that performs in-depth research into the science of marketing. And several years ago, Dr. McLaughlin came up with what he calls the value proposition question. So it's a framework for communicating that unique value. If I am your ideal prospect, why should I say yes to you rather than to your competitors? And of course, you should have an umbrella value proposition. Again, that big question, why should your prospect buy your product or service? And that encompasses your essential answer to the question of why should prospects do business with you rather than your competitors. But underneath the umbrella, all of those other yeses require their own value propositions. Your value proposition in its many forms from why should prospects open your emails to why should prospects take your call, all of the things we talked about earlier in the presentation, is a force that propels your prospects up and down the sales funnel or up and down that mountain. At every stage, the perceived value in your prospect's eyes must outweigh the perceived cost. Deb, any context here from you?
So I'd like everybody to think about the time you're talking with a prospect and you have just asked them a question, and what you get is a couple minutes or a pregnant pause with silence. And that prospect then says something like, well, gee, I never thought about that before, or that's a good question. Whenever that happens, make sure you make a note of what you just asked, because you're on the right track.
So to drill down even a little further and to wrap up the presentation, I just wanted to leave you with a few ideas and questions that should help you get thinking about how to find your own unique value, which I know we'll talk about more in our discussion in a few minutes. But one important point here, if what you do and what you offer already includes your own personal knowledge and experience, for example, if you're a strategic consultant, then this piece will come relatively easy to you since it's part of what you sell. But if what you offer is more commoditized, if your prospects could argue that they can get it just as easily from someone else, then this piece is especially important because it's the only way to set yourself apart from your competitors. So borrowing a concept from last month's presentation on the 7 skills of sales masters, one of the important roles sales reps can play is what we call the sales expert. And it's based on the fact that your experiences and knowledge are unique and your prospects can't get them anywhere else. When you successfully demonstrate unique insights to your prospects, they will see value in engaging with you. And nowhere is this more important than in a first-time appointment. And in a recent survey by the Rain Group, which is a sales training and consulting organization headquartered in Boston, they asked B2B decision makers what factors they take into account when agreeing to connect with a seller. 63% say they consider whether the seller offers something of value. And the only factors that scored higher were, number 1, whether they had a clear need for the product or service, and 2, whether they had the budget. So it's obviously a critical piece of this part of the equation. So now let's take your head that's full of these ideas, insights, and knowledge and think about packaging it as a value proposition for a first-time appointment with your prospect. So you first ask yourself, who do you want to meet with? So prospects, again, this touches back to my introductory comment about the slice of your target market that you really are homing in on. Prospects in a narrow sliver of the buying cycle on one end, so those who are actively considering solving a problem, or prospects at all stages of the cycle, those who might not be aware they have a problem. You want to align your value proposition to where the prospect is in that cycle. Are they at the dissonance stage where they have a general sense that something isn't quite working? Do they see a vague vision for the future so they know there's a future they have to prepare for, and they're thinking about what's the price of non-change or what's the future state going to look like? Are they evaluating choices, actively considering different options and the trade-offs involved with each? Or are they on the precipice of a decision where they're ready to decide, but inevitably they have last-minute concerns and need assurances that those risks are worth the upside? And then finally, ask yourself how you can help prospects at each of those stages. And this gets back to what Deborah mentioned in terms of thinking about those external facts, figures, trends, ideas that you can then combine with your own experiences and knowledge to provide something of real value. Do you have information, trends, or ideas that you might share with a prospect who's not interested in hiring a service like yours or switching vendors right now? You can ask, what has changed in your industry over the past year and a half that a prospect who has the same old vendor may not know about? Going back to something I touched on earlier, do you have intelligence about how other companies, maybe clients of yours, are adapting and preparing for future success? Are there any resources you offer to your current clients that you could also provide to prospects? And finally, what questions can your prospects ask themselves and their team to gain perspective and clarify decisions? And again, this is a great way to really offer value that your prospects will keep and will stick with them. Questions designed to get at those key pain points that they may not already be thinking about, so that it shifts their perspective and clarifies decisions.